James chapter 3 and verses 13 to 18. And it says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbour bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, of the devil. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace raise a harvest of righteousness." In the book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, there is a statement. For those who don't know, it is a spoof science fiction novel, but has one or two pertinent things to say into the world today. And one of its sayings is that anyone capable of being elected president should on no account be allowed to do the job. And I think sometimes when you look around the world and you see some people who are elected leaders and the way they conduct themselves, you can understand the thought behind that statement, that, these people have demonstrated perhaps more interest in themselves rather than actually in the people they are elected to lead. And in truth, leaders perhaps that we really look up to and we would really sort of say, well, there stands examples of leadership in this world that we would really sort of recommend and look up to are relatively few and far between. I was kind of struggling to think of a couple of names that perhaps everybody might say, oh yes, there was someone who really was a great leader, and did the best for their people in the way that they can. And sort of two names that I came up with were Nelson Mandela. I think that will be acknowledged as his time as president of South Africa was a time of great wisdom and leadership in a difficult time of trying to reunify a country that had been very bitterly divided one way or another. But then another name that comes to me is the name of Jimmy Carter, who very often is regarded as sort of an unsuccessful president of the United States, only has served one term. And yet I think actually in the way he has lived his life since and at the time has demonstrated those true marks of a real spiritual leader who is concerned to do the best for people in whatever circumstance. And if you don't know some of the things that Jimmy Carter's been up to, then it's worth knowing about that. He does things. I mean, he's in his 90s now, and I think he might actually have given up now, but he was involved in building homes for those people who couldn't afford them and things like that. So he was doing this well into his 80s and into his early 90s. And so there is a sort of example of a leader who is prepared to lead by example. Wisdom is an important subject in the New Testament and in the letter of James. When I did the first sermon in this series on James chapter 1, we glossed over a couple of verses and I said we'll come back to them. Well, this is where we come back to them, because in James 1 verses 2 to 5, it says this: "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance," which was the verse we particularly looked at on that occasion. Then it goes on to say, it says, "Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. And if any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault." So there's a clear link here in James's mind between wisdom and maturity in Christ and completeness. So he sees this subject as being very important, and he comes back to it in this passage that we looked at, these few verses at the end of James chapter 3. We've obviously, last week you went through the issue of taming the tongue and keeping the tongue under control, and that's a very wise thing to do, is to keep your tongue under control and to be sure that whatever comes out is wholesome and appropriate. But in a sense, what that should come from is what's happening within. And what's happening within is that we should be seeking to be wise people, full of God's wisdom. Because as James points out, there are two conflicting sets of wisdom that are going on. For he says, that if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, and of the devil. And there's certainly a lot of that unheavenly wisdom around and about. This is described as a dog-eat-dog world. But even more than that, actually, is that sort of behavior is even sort of elevated and made a virtue that, that you should be looking out to make, to do things for yourself, to not worry about the needs of other people. That it's almost, you should build up your own sort of worth at the expense of other people. That you step over other people in order to obtain your goals. That's almost really what's the message that comes out time and time again, that this is the way to success in the world, is to have this sort of selfish ambition. And also as well, to have an envy for what other people want, and to desire what other people want, and to seek and to strive to get what they have and even more. And that's, in one sense, is a lot of the advertising industry is based on that premise that, you set up this envy that you need to have this thing in order to have this perfect life. And of course, you get that, and then there'll be something else, and there'll be something else you must have. So, this is the wisdom of the world, that we should look after, number one, and, and self-reliance and all these sorts of things are sort of spoken about. And we shouldn't be relying on other people. We should, do all the things that we need to get on in the world and, blow everybody else. But James says that's not the wisdom that comes from heaven. He says that wisdom, he says in verse 13, is by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. So again, James comes back to this theme of, yes, faith in Jesus is at core. This is what makes us saved, but it needs to work its way out into action in our lives and to be demonstrated in our lives. And so he talks about the deeds done in humility that come from wisdom. Faith in God should always lead to action. And then James lists the other qualities that this wisdom should have. For it says that the wisdom that comes from heaven in verse 17, excuse me, 'tis hay fever season, is first of all pure. It's not malicious or manipulative. There are lots of people in this world who will pretend to be on your side, to pretend to understand what your needs are, to pretend to care about you. But in truth, they're actually out for themselves and they're manipulating. And the wisdom, in inverted commas, that they offer is actually to their benefit and not to yours. And they would offer advice that will put other people down and will build them up. So pure wisdom, the wisdom from heaven, must have this purity, that it's not self-interest that's the driver behind it. The second thing that James says here is that this peace must, or this wisdom must be peace loving. James has already said that worldly wisdom leads to disorder and every evil practice. God's wisdom brings order to chaos. God's wisdom brings people together rather than divides them. God's wisdom breaks down barriers, turns anger to calm and hatred to peace. This is the wisdom that comes from God, that seeks to bring people together to find solutions to problems that all people can live with, and brings respect for everybody involved. And when that peace comes about, then there is a rich reward. Right at the end of this passage, verse 18, James says, peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. And again, we can think, as I said, I mentioned Nelson Mandela, particularly in that, in regard of leadership. And I think we can perhaps see that in the way that certainly in the latter part of his life, he sought to bring people together and to break down the barriers that have previously divided people. And, we can think of him in those sorts of terms. The next thing that James says is that heavenly wisdom is considerate. Jesus said that there were two great commandments: love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your mind, and the second was love your neighbor as yourself. And so being considerate for the needs of other people is a mark of heavenly wisdom and of maturity in the Christian, making sure that other people's needs are met as far as possible. Now, sometimes it's not possible to meet everybody's needs. Sometimes it's not possible to meet everybody's demands of what they want. But at least we need to be taking them into consideration and to seek to find a way in which as many of those needs as possible can be met, and that people can feel respected and they can feel that their feelings and have been taken into account, and they feel that they're valued actually as people and not counted as something worthless that's just simply to be stepped over and left behind. And again, this is a contrast that people should see in us as Christians against, the philosophy of the world that we should be just simply looking after number one and below everybody else. Next thing that James says is that this wisdom brings about is submissive. What does this mean? Well, it means not seeking to dominate by force of personality or use of power or influence, But on the other hand, it doesn't actually mean being a doormat. Okay, so there's a sort of slight balancing act here. So it's not saying, that we should be, in there sort of shaking people by the lapels and trying to get our own way and all the rest of it. But there are times when we do have to stand up, and we do have to stand up and speak out on behalf, particularly of those who cannot stand up and speak for themselves. We need to stand up where we see injustice, where we see God's world being, despoiled and whatever. We need to be prepared to speak out on behalf of people who cannot stand up for themselves, and to say, there is something here that needs to be taken notice of. So it isn't a case that, submissiveness means that, as Christians, oh, well, we just let people walk over us and that's it. And, and, oh, well, that's the way of the kingdom sort of thing. That is that balancedness of not pushing ourselves forward and just sort of wanting our needs met all the time and trying to dominate the conversation. But sometimes we have to, if you like, try and turn the conversation in our direction in order to speak up on behalf of those who would otherwise suffer injustice, on the behalf of God's world that could otherwise be affected, to stand against those who would disrupt and who would cause hurt and harm. So that, again, is part of exercising heavenly wisdom. Heavenly wisdom, we're told by James, should also be full of mercy. Heavenly wisdom seeks to build people up rather than put them down, and to bring forgiveness instead of vengeance. Again, that's so often the way of the world, is that people want, feel that somehow they are owed something from the world because of something that's happened to them, what someone has done to them. Well, heavenly wisdom teaches us that actually we need to be merciful people as well. Peter said to Jesus, didn't he, how many times should I forgive my brother when he offends me or does something against me? Peter thought it was great that he said, should I do it 7 times? He thought that was fantastic. And Jesus said, no, it should be 70 times 7. In other words, so many times that you actually lose count. That's how we should be with people, willing to forgive them. And also, says James, this wisdom should produce good fruit. And again, good fruit is a recurring theme throughout the New Testament. You find it in Jesus talking about the parable of the sower and about the vine. You find about Paul talking about the fruit of the Spirit. And for James, it's this idea of wisdom, heavenly wisdom, when we act out heavenly wisdom, when it produces good deeds, that is the good fruit of the Spirit at work in us. The next attribute that James lists about this wisdom, heavenly wisdom, is that it should be impartial. That's a really hard thing to be, if we're honest, to be impartial, particularly when we do have, a little interest in the issue. It's very easy to try and tip the balance in our direction, or to tip the balance perhaps in favor of a friend or something or other like that. But we are called as Christians to seek to be impartial, not to have favorites. James has already talked about, you don't show favoritism to the rich person over the poor person. You've got to have impartiality in the way that you treat people, in the way that you try and judge issues, and you try and look for the just and the right approach in all these situations, however hard it might be and however tempting it might be, to tip the balance one way or another, particularly if that balance happens to go in our favor. And the last thing that James lists here is that wisdom should be sincere. And that's, again, something people are very, very suspicious these days. People are very, very, suspicious of anyone in authority quite often. I mean, we've had all these issues through the virus of people sort of spreading all sorts of rumors and saying, oh, well, these people, they just want to do this and they want to do that. They just want to manipulate you. They're not doing the best thing for you. And people are very suspicious and that, and whatever, folks. So, there is a battle to be won of demonstrating sincerity to people, that we do mean what we say. If we say that we'll do something, we'll do it. And, that if we say this is, the way forward, we will act upon that in accordance with that. So, there has to be an honesty, there has to be an integrity in what we're doing, and people need to see that in our lives. So it's quite a tough list that James lists out here, that this wisdom needs to be pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. That is, a tough list. But thank goodness that the wisdom that James is talking about comes from heaven. It's not from us. It is a gift from God. And as James said right back in chapter 1, if we lack wisdom, we should go to God and ask him for it. And we should ask him, because we recognize that this is not going to happen overnight. You don't suddenly become the wisest person in the universe. Things have to change. And we sang about refiner's fire, and the refining process of metal is quite a prolonged and involved thing. And it's the same with us, that God has to do and has to continue doing a work in us so that we can reflect more of the kingdom through us and more of Jesus through us. Because the greatest wisdom, of course, comes from Christ. As we read at the beginning of this service, to those whom God has called, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Jesus became for us wisdom from God, now brought to us by the Holy Spirit. So let us aim, as James has encouraged us to do, to seek to become more mature and complete, to persevere in our faith, and to ask God for his wisdom to come and live in us, that we can demonstrate this heavenly wisdom in our lives each and every day, and in so doing, proclaim the good news of the kingdom. Amen.